The bitter winter wind carried a woman's desperate cries across the desolate Montana plains, as Nora Adams clutched her feverish infant son to her breast, knowing that without help he wouldn't survive the night. The blizzard had intensified since sundown, blanketing their isolated homestead in unforgiving white and cutting them off from the nearest town of Whispering Pines. As the baby's frail body burned with fever, Nora's tears froze on her cheeks while she prayed for a miracle that seemed impossible in the harsh winter of 1878. Nora had been alone since her husband Thomas had died 3 months earlier from a mining accident, leaving her to manage their small homestead with a newborn baby. She had been strong, learning to handle the daily chores while caring for little James, but nothing had prepared her for the terrifying moment when her baby's skin turned burning hot and his breathing became labored and raspy. "Please, James, stay with me," Nora whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. The heat radiating from his tiny body terrified her. She had tried every home remedy she knew: cool cloths, herbal teas, prayers, but nothing had broken the fever. Without medicine from town, she knew the outcome was grim. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and Dr. Williams in Whispering Pines was 15 miles beyond that. With the snow drifts piling higher by the hour and temperatures plummeting, venturing out seemed impossible. But staying meant watching her baby die. Nora tucked James more securely against her body, beneath her heavy wool coat. She wrote a desperate note and left it on the table in case anyone came looking for her. Then, wrapping them both in every blanket she could spare, she stepped out into the howling storm. The wind immediately slapped her face, stealing her breath. Snow swirled around her in angry gusts as she trudged forward, one painful step at a time, following what she hoped was the path toward the Jenkins homestead. If she could reach them, perhaps Mr. Jenkins could fetch the doctor, or at least have medicine to bring down James's fever. Time blurred as she pushed against the relentless storm. Her legs grew numb, her arms ached from holding James close, but she refused to stop. Every step was for her child, her only reason for living. "Just a little farther," she kept whispering, though she had long since lost track of where she was. The landmarks she knew were buried under snow, and the darkness made navigation nearly impossible. Fear crept into her heart as she realized they might both freeze to death in the endless white. Miles away, Yates Remington pulled his hat lower over his eyes and urged his horse forward through the blinding snow. The experienced cowboy had worked the Montana ranges for 8 years, but even he questioned his decision to push through this storm. Still, he'd given his word to deliver the medicine to the doctor in Whispering Pines, and a Remington never broke his word. "Come on, Thunder," he encouraged his horse, patting the stallion's neck. "Just a few more miles." Yates had been in Fort Benton when Dr. Williams sent an urgent telegraph requesting medical supplies for an influenza outbreak that had hit Whispering Pines. The regular supply wagon wasn't due for another week, and children were already dying. When the stagecoach refused to make the journey through the gathering storm, Yates had volunteered. The saddlebags draped across Thunder's flanks contained precious vials of medicine that could save dozens of lives if he could deliver them. The wind howled around him, and visibility was down to mere feet. Yates relied on Thunder's instincts and his own knowledge of the terrain to guide them. He had planned to reach the Jenkins homestead by nightfall and continue to town in the morning, but the storm had slowed their progress considerably. Just as Yates was considering finding shelter to wait out the worst of the blizzard, Thunder suddenly pulled up short, ears pricking forward. Yates squinted through the swirling snow, unable to see what had caught his horse's attention. "What is it, boy?" he asked, reaching for his rifle. Wolves were known to hunt during storms when prey was vulnerable. Thunder snorted and stepped forward cautiously. Then Yates saw a dark shape huddled in the snow. As he drew closer, his heart stopped. It was a woman, collapsed in a drift, clutching something to her chest. Yates leapt from his saddle, kneeling beside the motionless figure. Brushing snow from her face, he found a young woman, her lips blue with cold. He checked for a pulse, sighing with relief when he felt a faint beat beneath his fingers. "Madam, can you hear me?" he called, gently shaking her shoulder. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she whispered something inaudible. Then Yates noticed what she was holding, a bundle wrapped in blankets. With careful hands, he pulled back the fabric to reveal a baby's face, flushed with fever despite the freezing cold. "My baby," the woman suddenly gasped, her eyes flying open in panic. "Please save my baby, I've got you both," Yates assured her, though worry gnawed at his gut. The infant's labored breathing and burning skin spoke of serious illness, while the mother was dangerously close to freezing. "What's your name, madam?" "Nora," she whispered, her strength clearly fading. "Nora Adams, my son, James, he needs medicine, the fever." "I'm Yates Remington," he told her as he carefully lifted both mother and child into his arms. "And it just so happens I'm carrying medicine to Whispering Pines." Hope flickered across Nora's exhausted face before her eyes closed again. Working quickly, Yates secured them both on Thunder. He mounted behind them, wrapping his heavy coat around all three as best he could. The Jenkins homestead was still the closest shelter, and he steered Thunder in that direction, praying they'd make it in time. The journey was arduous. Yates kept one arm firmly around Nora and the baby, while using the other to guide Thunder through the worsening conditions. He could feel the infant's heat even through the blankets, a stark contrast to Nora's chilled body. "Hold on," he murmured, unsure if she could hear him. "Just hold on." After what felt like hours, the dim glow of the Jenkins homestead appeared through the storm. Yates had never been more grateful to see lamplight in his life. He called out as they approached, and soon the door flew open, revealing Edward Jenkins with a lantern held high. "Good Lord," Jenkins exclaimed, rushing forward to help. "Yates Remington." "What in heaven's name found them in the snow?" Yates explained as he carefully dismounted with his precious cargo. "The baby's burning with fever and Mrs. Adams is half frozen." Martha Jenkins appeared at her husband's side, her face creasing with concern. "Bring them inside, quickly." The warmth of the Jenkins cabin was a blessed relief. Martha immediately took charge, directing Yates to place Nora near the fire while she examined baby James. "The poor little mite is burning up," Martha confirmed, her experienced hands unwrapping the infant. "Edward, fetch more blankets." "Yates, you mentioned medicine?" Yates nodded, already retrieving his saddlebags from Thunder. "For the influenza outbreak in Whispering Pines, Dr. Williams requested it specifically for reducing fever and easing breathing." Martha's eyes lit with hope. "That's exactly what this child needs." "How much can we spare?" Yates didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes. I promise to deliver medicine that would save lives. This little one counts." While Martha prepared a small dose of the medicine for James, Yates turned his attention to Nora. Her face was pale, her lips still tinged with blue, but her breathing had steadied. He removed her wet outer clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets, careful to preserve her modesty while ensuring she'd warm up properly. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice her delicate features, the determination that remained evident even in unconsciousness. What kind of courage had it taken for her to venture into a blizzard with her sick child? The thought stirred something in his chest, admiration, certainly, but something more that he couldn't quite name. Nora's eyelids fluttered open as he was tucking a blanket around her shoulders. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, then panic. "James," she cried, trying to sit up. "He's right here," Yates assured her, gently pressing her back. "Mrs. Jenkins is giving him medicine, the same medicine I was bringing to town." Nora's eyes, a striking shade of hazel, locked onto his. "You're real then, I thought I dreamed you." A small smile tugged at Yates's lips. "I'm real enough, Mrs. Adams. How did you find us, in that storm?" "Thunder found you," Yates explained, nodding toward where his horse was now being tended by Edward near the cabin's small stable area. "He's got better senses than I do." Martha approached with baby James, now swaddled in fresh blankets. "The medicine's already helping. His breathing's easier, though the fever will take time to break." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks as Martha placed James in her arms. The baby's face was still flushed, but his breathing did sound less labored. Nora pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. Thank you, she whispered, looking from Martha to Yates. I was sure we would die out there. You very nearly did, Martha said sternly, though her eyes were kind. What possessed you to leave home in such weather? James got sick so suddenly, Nora explained, her voice breaking. By afternoon he was burning up, struggling to breathe. I tried everything I knew, but nothing helped. I couldn't just sit and watch him. She couldn't finish the sentence. Yates's throat tightened at the raw emotion in her voice. You did what any mother would do, he said softly. You fought for your child. Nora's grateful gaze met his, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that surprised him with its immediacy. Martha broke the moment, insisting they all needed rest. The storm showed no signs of abating, and they would all be staying at the Jenkins homestead at least until morning. Yates would take the small back room, while Nora and baby James would have the Jenkins' own bed, a suggestion they firmly refused to allow Nora to decline. As Nora drifted to sleep with James cradled against her, Yates sat by the fire with Edward, discussing the weather and the journey still ahead to Whispering Pines. That woman's got more courage than most men I know, Edward commented, nodding toward the bedroom where Nora slept. Walking 5 miles in this blizzard with a sick baby. Where's her husband? Yates asked quietly. Thomas Adams, Edward sighed. Good man, died in a mining collapse 3 months back, left her alone with a newborn in that small homestead of theirs. He shook his head sadly. She's been managing on her own since then. Stubborn as they come, wouldn't accept help unless she was desperate. Yates stared into the flames, picturing Nora trudging through snowdrifts, refusing to surrender to the elements or to despair. She must love that child something fierce. He's all she has left, Edward replied simply. That night, as Yates lay on the narrow cot in the back room, he found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to Nora Adams, her courage, her desperation, the feel of her in his arms as he'd carried her to safety. He'd known many women in his 30 years, but none who had affected him so quickly or so deeply. Dawn broke with the storm finally weakening, though snow still fell steadily. Yates rose early, helping Edward with the morning chores while Martha prepared breakfast. When Nora emerged from the bedroom with James, Yates was struck by the transformation. Though still pale and clearly exhausted, she had regained some color, and her hazel eyes were alert and determined. How is he this morning? Martha asked, immediately checking the baby. His fever broke during the night, Nora replied, her relief evident. He's still warm, but nothing like before, and he took some milk just now. The medicine's working, Yates observed, feeling an unexpected surge of pride that his delivery had helped save the child. Nora's gaze found his. Mr. Remington, I don't know how to thank you if you hadn't found us. Yates, he corrected her gently, and there's no need for thanks. I'm just glad Thunder has good eyes. Over breakfast, they discussed what would happen next. The medicine Yates carried was still urgently needed in Whispering Pines, and he intended to continue his journey as soon as possible. Nora insisted on returning to her homestead, despite Martha's protests that she should stay longer to recover. I have animals that need tending, Nora explained. And James is improving. We've imposed on your hospitality enough. You can't possibly walk back in these conditions, Edward argued. I'll take her, Yates found himself saying. All eyes turned to him in surprise, including his own. He hadn't planned the offer, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were right. I'll escort Mrs. Adams home, make sure she and the baby are settled, then continue to Whispering Pines. That's miles out of your way, Nora protested. The medicine is already late, Yates finished for her. A few more hours won't make a difference, and I'd feel better knowing you got home safely. Something in his tone must have convinced her, for Nora nodded her acceptance. Thank you, but please call me Nora. By mid-morning they were ready to depart. Martha packed food for them both, extra blankets, and a small vial of medicine for James, just in case. Edward brought Thunder around, now rested and fed, while Yates secured the saddlebags and prepared for the additional passenger. Mounting was a delicate operation with Nora holding James, but they managed it with Yates settling in the saddle first, then Edward helping Nora up to sit in front of him. The arrangement was intimate by necessity. Yates's arms encircled her to hold the reins, and her back pressed against his chest. The sweet scent of her hair mingled with the cold air as they set off. "Your homestead is southwest of here," Yates confirmed as they left the Jenkins property. "Yes, about 5 miles. There's a creek that runs near it and a stand of pines to the north." Nora shifted slightly, adjusting James against her. "I'm not even sure which direction I was walking when you found me. I was so disoriented." "You were headed almost directly east," Yates told her, "away from both your home and the Jenkins place, another hour end." He left the sentence unfinished, unwilling to voice the grim outcome that had been averted. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds being Thunder's steady breathing, the crunch of snow beneath his hooves, and James's occasional soft noises. Despite the cold, Yates felt a warmth spreading through him from Nora's proximity. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman, and never one who stirred such protective feelings. "Have you lived in Montana territory long?" Nora asked eventually, breaking the silence. 8 years, Yates replied. "Came west after the war, worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the Army, odd jobs here and there. Last few years I've been working for the Diamond K Ranch, but this is my off-season." "So you volunteered to deliver medicine during your time off?" There was a note of surprise in her voice. Yates shrugged, though she couldn't see it. "Seemed the right thing to do. No one else was willing to make the journey in this weather." "That says something about your character, Yates Remington," he chuckled softly. "Or my good sense, depending on who you ask." "I'm inclined to say the former," Nora replied, a smile evident in her tone. "What about you?" Yates asked. "How long have you been out here?" Nora's body tensed slightly before she answered. "Almost 2 years. Thomas and I came from Pennsylvania." He had dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines. "I'm sorry about your husband," Yates said quietly. "Edward told me." A long pause followed before Nora spoke again. "Thank you, it's been difficult, especially with James." She took a deep breath that Yates felt against his chest. "But we're managing." The simple courage in those words stirred his admiration once more. So many would have given up, gone back east to family, or sought the charity of neighbors. But Nora Adams was fighting to maintain the life she and her husband had built, even alone with a baby in one of the harshest territories in America. As they crested a small rise, Nora pointed ahead. "There, you can just see the chimney through those trees." Yates followed her gesture and saw a small cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines. A thin wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney. The fire she'd banked before leaving had somehow survived her absence. The homestead was modest but well-maintained, with a small barn to one side and what would be a garden patch come spring, now buried under snow. "It's not much," Nora said, a defensive note creeping into her voice. "It's more than most have," Yates replied honestly. "You've built something real here." They approached the cabin, and Yates dismounted first before helping Nora down with James. The baby was awake now, his blue eyes clearer than they had been the night before, regarding Yates with innocent curiosity. "Let me check on the animals first," Nora said, but Yates shook his head. "You take James inside and get warm. I'll see to the animals." She looked about to protest, then nodded gratefully. "The barn key is hanging by the door. There's just the milk cow, 2 chickens, and a goat." While Nora took James inside, Yates tended to the livestock. The animals were hungry but otherwise fine, protected from the worst of the storm in the sturdy little barn. He fed and watered them, noticing the neat organization of the small space. Everything had its place, and despite limited resources, the animals were well cared for. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he found Nora had started a fresh fire and was preparing something at the small stove. James was asleep in a cradle near the hearth. "I'm making coffee," she explained, gesturing for him to sit. "It's the least I can offer before you continue your journey." Yates removed his hat and coat, hanging them by the door. The cabin's interior was as tidy as the barn, with simple furnishings that showed care despite their obvious age. A few personal touches: a sampler on the wall, a vase of dried wildflowers, a small shelf of books hinted at Nora's attempts to make the frontier cabin a home. "You've done well with this place," Yates commented, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Thomas built most of it," Nora said, sitting across from him with her own cup. "I've just tried to keep it from falling apart. You've done more than that." Yates took a sip of the surprisingly good coffee. "Not everyone could manage alone out here. I haven't had much choice." There was no self-pity in her tone, just frank acknowledgement of her circumstances. "But I've learned a great deal, things I never imagined doing back in Pennsylvania." Yates studied her over the rim of his cup. In the cabin's light, he could see details he'd missed before: the faint freckles across her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her hazel eyes. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of town women, but in a real, vital way that spoke of strength and resilience. "What will you do when spring comes?" he asked. Nora's gaze drifted to the window where snow still fell steadily. "Plant the garden, maybe get another cow if I can trade for one, take in washing or sewing from town if needed." She looked back at him, her expression resolute. "Keep going forward, I suppose." Alone, the question hung in the air between them, more loaded than he'd intended. Nora's cheeks flushed slightly, though whether from the fire's heat or his inquiry he couldn't tell. "That's been my plan," she said carefully, "although after last night." Her voice trailed off and she glanced at James sleeping peacefully. "I realize how precarious our situation is. If something happens to me or if James needs help I can't provide, you need neighbors closer," Yates suggested, "or to be nearer to town." "Moving isn't an option," Nora replied firmly. "This land is what Thomas left us. It's James's inheritance." Yates nodded, understanding her attachment to the homestead went beyond practicality. It was her connection to her husband, the future she'd planned with him that she was trying to salvage for their son. A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their coffee. Yates knew he should leave soon. The journey to Whispering Pines would take several more hours, and he'd already delayed longer than planned. Yet he found himself reluctant to go, drawn to this brave young widow and her child in a way he couldn't fully explain. Finally, duty won out over desire, and he rose to his feet. "I should get moving if I want to reach town before dark." Disappointment flashed across Nora's face, quickly masked. "Of course, you've already done more than enough for us." She stood as well, and for a moment they were close enough that Yates could see the fine details of her eyelashes, the small scar near her temple, the fullness of her lips. An impulse to reach out and touch her face nearly overwhelmed him, but he restrained himself. "I'll check back on you and James when I return from Whispering Pines," he said instead. "Make sure you're both still doing well." Hope brightened her features. "You don't have to do that. I know," Yates smiled gently. "I want to." As he prepared to leave, gathering his coat and hat, Nora wrapped a small package of food for his journey. At the door, she suddenly reached out and caught his hand. "Yates," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip. "Thank you. Not just for finding us, but for treating us like we matter." Without thinking, Yates raised her hand to his lips, pressing a brief kiss to her knuckles. "You do matter, Nora Adams, more than you know." Then he was gone, mounting thunder and continuing his journey to Whispering Pines, leaving Nora standing in the doorway with her fingers still tingling from his touch, and her mind full of questions about the cowboy who had saved her son's life. The days following Yates's departure were both ordinary and transformed for Nora. On the surface, she returned to her routine, tending the animals, caring for James, maintaining the cabin. But internally, everything had shifted. Her brush with death in the blizzard had forced her to confront the precariousness of their isolated existence. And the memory of Yates Remington, his steady presence and unexpected kindness, lingered like a warming flame. James recovered quickly, the medicine Yates had provided breaking his fever completely by the second day. As Nora watched her son's health return, gratitude overwhelmed her. Had it not been for that chance encounter in the storm, she might have lost everything. 4 days after leaving Nora's homestead, Yates returned as promised. The sight of him approaching on thunder sent an unexpected flutter through Nora's chest. She'd been checking the horizon frequently, though she tried to tell herself it was merely practical concern about the weather. "You came back," she said as he dismounted, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. Yates's smile lit his face, crinkling the corners of his blue eyes. "I said I would." He carried a small crate of supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities she'd been running low on. When she protested the gesture, he simply shrugged. The folks in Whispering Pines were mighty grateful for that medicine. Dr. Williams insisted I take these supplies as additional payment. Nora suspected this wasn't entirely true, but she accepted the gifts with genuine thanks. As they sat at her small table sharing coffee, Yates filled her in on his journey to town and the influenza outbreak that was now under control thanks to the medicine. "How long will you stay in the area?" Nora asked, trying to sound casual. "I'm due back at the Diamond K in April," Yates replied. "Until then, I've taken some odd jobs around Whispering Pines. The sheriff hired me to help with winter patrols." "That's nearly 3 months," Nora observed, hope warming her despite her attempts to remain practical. A man like Yates Remington surely had women interested in him in town. A widow with a baby on an isolated homestead would hardly be appealing by comparison, yet he had come back to check on them. And as the weeks passed, he continued to return, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to help with chores that were difficult for her to manage alone. He repaired her roof, chopped firewood that would last well into spring, and reinforced the barn door that had begun to sag on its hinges. Each visit lengthened, until Yates was staying for meals and lingering into the evening. They would talk by the fire after James was asleep, sharing stories of their pasts and cautious hopes for the future. Nora learned that Yates had fought for the Union in the final year of the war, barely more than a boy, that he had a sister back in Ohio who wrote regularly, that he'd come west seeking something he couldn't define but recognized as a hunger for open spaces and honest work. In turn, she told him about growing up in a small Pennsylvania town, daughter of the local schoolteacher. About meeting Thomas at a church social and being swept away by his dreams of Western adventure. About the difficult journey west and the harsh reality of frontier life that had tested but never broken their marriage. "You regret coming here?" Yates asked one evening in late February as they sat beside the fire, a comfortable silence having fallen between them. Nora considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It's been harder than I imagined, especially since losing Thomas, but this land has shaped me, made me stronger. And James was born here." She smiled at the mention of her son, now sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "Besides, had we stayed in Pennsylvania, I would never have met you." The admission slipped out before she could censor it, and heat rushed to her cheeks. Yates's gaze intensified, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "That alone makes me grateful you came west," he said softly, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Nora was acutely aware that they were alone, that propriety suggested she shouldn't have a man in her home this late, especially with her growing attraction to him. Yet she couldn't bring herself to end their time together. Yates seemed to sense her conflict. He stood, reluctance evident in his movements. "It's getting late. I should head back to town." Nora rose as well, disappointment mingling with relief. "Will I see you again soon? Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised with a smile that made her heart skip. At the door, he paused, then gently took her hand. "Nora, I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband, and I respect your grief, but I want you to know that I've come to care for you and James a great deal." Nora's breath caught. "Yates, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. Whatever happens next or doesn't happen is entirely up to you." With that, he pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead and departed, leaving Nora with a whirlwind of emotions. She stood in the doorway long after he'd vanished from sight, her mind replaying his words and the tender look in his eyes. That night, as she lay in bed, Nora confronted feelings she'd been avoiding. She had loved Thomas deeply and mourned him still. But the heart, it seemed, had a capacity for renewal she hadn't anticipated. Her growing feelings for Yates didn't diminish what she'd shared with Thomas. They were different, born of different circumstances and a different version of herself. Thomas had loved her youthful optimism and sheltered gentility. Yates was drawn to the woman she'd become stronger, more self-reliant, tempered by hardship but not broken by it. And she was drawn to his quiet strength, his kindness, and the way he saw her not as a helpless widow to be pitied, but as a woman of value and courage. The following week brought a thaw, the first hint that winter's grip was loosening. Patches of ground emerged from beneath the snow, and the creek near Nora's property began to flow more freely. With the improved weather came a flurry of activity as Nora prepared for spring planting. Yates arrived one afternoon to find her attempting to repair a broken plow. He watched her for a moment, admiring her determination before making his presence known. "That's a two-person job at least," he commented, dismounting and approaching her. Nora brushed hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her forehead that Yates found inexplicably endearing. "I don't have the luxury of waiting for help." "You do today," he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. They worked together through the afternoon, their bodies falling into a natural rhythm as they repaired not just the plow but several other tools that needed attention before spring planting. Nora found herself laughing more than she had in months, delighting in Yates's dry humor and the easy companionship between them. As the sun began to set, they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the changing colors paint the sky. James played on a blanket at their feet, now nearly 6 months old and growing stronger each day. The baby had taken to Yates immediately, responding to his deep voice with excited kicks and gummy smiles. "He likes you," Nora observed as Yates gently tickled James's belly, eliciting a delighted gurgle. "Smart boy," Yates replied with a grin. "Gets that from his mother." Nora felt a blush warm her cheeks. These moments of casual intimacy had become more frequent, each one chipping away at the careful reserve she'd maintained since Thomas's death. "I've been thinking," Yates said after a comfortable silence, his gaze still on the horizon, "about what happens when I return to the Diamond K." Nora's heart sank. She'd been avoiding thoughts of his inevitable departure, knowing his job would take him away for months at a time. "When do you leave?" 2 weeks, he replied, turning to face her. "But that's not what I wanted to discuss." Curiosity replaced her disappointment. "Oh." "The Diamond K is only about 30 miles from here," Yates explained. "Not so far that I couldn't ride over regularly, especially if—" He hesitated, then continued with determination. "Especially if I had reason to." Nora's pulse quickened. "What sort of reason?" Yates took a deep breath. "The kind of reason that comes from caring deeply for a woman and her child. The kind that might, in time, lead to more permanent arrangements." The implication was clear, though he was careful not to press too directly. Nora appreciated his sensitivity to her situation, his understanding that she needed time. "I think," she said carefully, her eyes meeting his, "that would be a very good reason." Joy lit Yates's features, and he reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "I don't want to rush you, Nora. I know you're still healing, but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, I'm here." Impulsively, Nora leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for understanding." The moment might have deepened, but James chose that instant to demand attention with an indignant cry. They both laughed, the tension breaking as Nora scooped up her son. "He has impeccable timing," Yates observed wryly. "A quality that will serve him well in life," Nora replied, smiling as she soothed the baby. That evening, as they shared a simple meal, the atmosphere between them was charged with new awareness. Nora found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before: the strong line of Yates's jaw, the gentle way his hands moved as he held his cup, the deep timbre of his laugh that seemed to resonate through her. When it came time for him to leave, neither seemed eager for the evening to end. At the door, Yates paused, his eyes searching hers. "I'll be back in 3 days," he promised. "Sooner if weather permits." "I'll be counting the hours," Nora admitted, no longer hiding her feelings. Yates's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. "May I?" he asked softly. Nora nodded, her heart racing as he leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Nora responded. It was a kiss of promise, of beginnings rather than passion, and all the more meaningful for its restraint. When they parted, Yates's eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the moment you opened your eyes in the Jenkins cabin." "I'm glad you finally did," Nora whispered, her fingers lightly touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. He left reluctantly, glancing back several times as if to reassure himself she was real. Nora stood watching until he disappeared into the gathering dusk, her mind and heart full of possibilities she hadn't dared contemplate just weeks before. True to his word, Yates returned 3 days later. This visit brought another shift in their relationship as Nora finally shared the full story of Thomas's death, not just the bare facts she'd mentioned before, but the devastating impact it had on her. The terror of being left alone with a newborn in the wilderness, and her determination to honor his memory by preserving the home they'd built together. Yates listened with unwavering attention, offering comfort when her voice broke but never interrupting. When she finished, he took her hands in his. "You honor him every day by raising your son with such courage," he told her. "But Nora, you deserve happiness too. Thomas would want that for you." "I believe he would," she agreed, surprising herself with how right the words felt. "He wasn't a jealous man. He wanted me to be taken care of, to be happy. And are you?" Yates asked softly. "Happy, I mean." Nora considered the question, looking around the small cabin that had been the setting for both her deepest grief and, increasingly, moments of unexpected joy. "I'm finding my way back to it," she answered honestly. "And you've been a big part of that, Yates." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I'm doing something right." The days that followed were filled with a deepening connection. Yates began spending more time at the homestead, helping with spring preparations and simply being part of their daily life. James grew increasingly attached to him, reaching for Yates whenever he appeared and fussing when he left. One evening, as Yates rocked James to sleep, singing a low cowboy lullaby, Nora was struck by the perfect rightness of the scene. This man, who had literally carried medicine through a storm to save her child, was now cradling that same child with such natural tenderness that it made her heart ache. "You're good with him," she observed from the doorway. Yates looked up, his expression soft in the lamplight. "He makes it easy." "He's a remarkable boy." "Like his father," Nora said, then clarified, "Thomas was good with children too. He would have been a wonderful father." "I'm sure he would have," Yates agreed, with no trace of jealousy or discomfort at the mention of her late husband. It was one of the things she appreciated most about him, his understanding that Thomas would always be part of her life, part of James's heritage. After placing the sleeping baby in his cradle, Yates joined Nora by the fire. There was a new tension in his posture, a sense of decision that piqued her curiosity. "I have something to ask you," he began, his usually confident voice tinged with nervousness. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer, nothing changes about how I feel." Nora's pulse quickened. "Go on." "I'm leaving for the Diamond K in 10 days, he said. "The work will keep me there most days, though as I said, I could visit regularly." He took a deep breath. "But I've been thinking that there's another option, one that would mean I could be here more often, if not every day." "What option is that?" Nora asked, though she thought she knew where he was heading. "Marriage," Yates said simply. "Not right away if you're not ready, but I love you, Nora Adams. I love James too, and I want to build a life with you both, here on this land if that's what you want." Though she'd suspected his intentions, hearing the words aloud still took her breath away. "You love me, more than I thought possible," he confirmed, taking her hands in his. "I know it's been quick, and I know you might need more time." Nora stopped his words with a finger to his lips. "I love you too, Yates. I wasn't looking for it, wasn't expecting it, but it found me anyway." Joy transformed his features. "Then you'll consider my proposal?" "I'll do more than consider it," Nora replied, her heart full to bursting. "I accept." Yates pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Are you sure? I don't want to rush you." "Life is too uncertain to waste time when you know what you want," Nora said firmly. "The blizzard taught me that. We could have died that night instead. We found each other. I'm not willing to risk losing that gift by waiting." They decided to marry before Yates left for the Diamond K. The ceremony would be small, just the Jenkins as witnesses, Dr. Williams to officiate, and a few townsfolk from Whispering Pines who had come to know Yates during his winter there. Nora would wear the blue dress she'd brought from Pennsylvania, saved for special occasions, and James would be in the new outfit Martha Jenkins had sewn for him. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Yates moved his few possessions to the homestead, building shelves and expanding the small cabin to better accommodate their family. They discussed the future openly, how they would manage the homestead together, Yates's work at the Diamond K, and their hopes for James and perhaps more children someday. The night before their wedding, Yates stayed in town as a concession to tradition. Alone in the cabin with James, Nora felt a momentary pang of doubt. Was she doing the right thing? Was it too soon? Would Thomas approve? As if in answer, a warm breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of pine and early spring. It reminded her of something Thomas had said on his deathbed. "Live fully, Nora. Don't let grief trap you in the past." Peace settled over her. Tomorrow she would marry a man who had come into their lives like a miracle, braving a deadly storm to bring healing. A man who saw her strength as well as her vulnerability, who treated her son as his own, who understood that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but building something new from the foundation that remained. The wedding day dawned clear and surprisingly warm for early April. Martha Jenkins arrived early to help Nora prepare, bringing wildflowers to adorn the cabin and Nora's hair. Edward followed later with Dr. Williams and several townsfolk who had been eager to witness the union of the brave widow and the cowboy who'd carried medicine through the storm, a story that had become something of a legend in Whispering Pines over the winter. When Yates arrived, his normally confident demeanor gave way to visible nervousness that endeared him even more to Nora. He traded his usual work clothes for a clean suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. The look of awe that crossed his face when he saw Nora in her blue dress was something she knew she would treasure forever. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply meaningful. Dr. Williams spoke of the unexpected ways love could find people, of resilience and second chances. Yates's vows, spoken in his deep, steady voice, promised not just love and fidelity, but partnership and understanding. Nora's own vows acknowledged both the past and the future, honoring what had been while embracing what was to come. When Dr. Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with such tender reverence that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes. James, secure in Martha's arms, chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, bringing laughter from the small gathering. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. The townsfolk had brought food to share, and Edward Jenkins produced a fiddle that filled the homestead with lively music. Nora watched in amusement as Yates was congratulated and good-naturedly teased by his new friends from Whispering Pines. "You've made quite an impression on this town," she commented when he finally made his way back to her side. Yates slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Not half the impression you've made on me, Mrs. Remington." The new name sent a thrill through her. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. As evening approached, their guests began to depart, leaving the newly formed family to their first night together. Martha was the last to leave, handing James back to Nora with a knowing smile. "You've found a good man," she said quietly. "I'm so happy for you both." When they were finally alone, a new shyness fell between them. For all their growing closeness over the past months, this threshold represented something significant. Yates seemed to understand, approaching her with gentle patience. "We have time," he assured her, taking James and settling him in his cradle with practiced ease. "All the time we need." The tenderness in his voice melted away any lingering nervousness. This was Yates, her husband now, but still the same man whose steady presence had become her anchor. The man who had risked his life to save her child, who had seen her at her most desperate and vulnerable, and who had loved her through it all. That night, as they came together as husband and wife, Nora discovered yet another dimension of their connection. Yates's passion was tempered by reverence, his strength by gentleness. In his arms, she felt both protected and empowered, cherished for exactly who she was. Later, as they lay wrapped in each other's embrace, the moonlight streaming through the window, Yates traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Nora lifted her head to meet his gaze, her heart full to overflowing. "More than I ever thought possible again." His smile held both satisfaction and promise. "This is just the beginning, Nora, just the beginning of everything," and she knew he was right. Their story had begun in a desperate moment during a deadly storm, but it would continue through all the seasons of life, the harsh winters and verdant springs, the abundant summers and golden autumns. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, strengthened by a love that had been forged in the crucible of survival and sacrifice. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, no longer threatening but soothing, as if nature itself approved of the union formed beneath its watchful gaze. Inside the small cabin, warmed by love and newfound hope, Nora and Yates Remington drifted to sleep in each other's arms, their future stretching before them like the vast Montana sky boundless with possibility. The years that followed their wedding brought both joy and challenges to the Remington homestead. Yates divided his time between working at the Diamond K Ranch and developing their own property, gradually expanding their livestock and improving the land. Nora's garden flourished, providing not only food for their family, but excess produce she could sell or trade in Whispering Pines. James grew from a baby into a sturdy toddler, taking his first steps across the cabin floor with Yates's encouraging hands outstretched to catch him. His first word was "Pa," directed at Yates with such natural certainty that it brought tears to the cowboy's eyes. "He really thinks of me as his father," Yates had whispered to Nora that night as they watched their son sleep. "You are his father," Nora replied firmly. "In all the ways that truly matter." When James was 18 months old, Nora discovered she was expecting their second child. The news filled their home with excitement and preparation. Yates fussed over Nora with such devoted attention that she finally had to gently remind him she wasn't made of porcelain. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she told him with an amused smile. "And I've done this before, remember?" "That doesn't make you any less precious to me," he responded, kissing her soundly, "or make me any less determined to take care of you both." Their daughter, Elizabeth Martha Remington, was born on a warm June evening in 1880, with Martha Jenkins serving as midwife. She had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's determined chin, a combination that Yates declared would make her a force to be reckoned with. James approached his new sister with cautious fascination, peering into her cradle with wide blue eyes. "Baby," he announced solemnly, reaching out to gently touch her tiny hand. When Elizabeth instinctively curled her fingers around his, a look of wonder spread across his face. "That's right, son," Yates said, kneeling beside him. "That's your little sister. And you're going to be the best big brother a girl could have." The family's rhythm adjusted to accommodate their newest member. Nora watched with loving appreciation as Yates took on midnight feedings without complaint, walking the floor with Elizabeth when she was fussy, all while ensuring that James still received plenty of attention and affection. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James and Elizabeth both asleep inside, Yates took Nora's hand. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" he asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "If I hadn't volunteered to carry that medicine, if you hadn't been brave enough to seek help for James." Nora shuddered slightly at the thought. "Sometimes, but mostly I'm just grateful for whatever forces brought us together." "Providence," Yates suggested, his gaze on the darkening sky. "My mother always said God works in mysterious ways. I reckon finding you and James half buried in a snowdrift qualifies as mysterious." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "However it happened, I thank God every day that you found us." As their children grew, so did the homestead. With careful management and hard work, they were able to purchase adjoining land when it became available. Yates built a larger cabin with help from neighbors, creating a proper bedroom for the children and more space for their growing family. A small orchard took root on the eastern edge of the property, promising fruit in the coming years. The Diamond K eventually offered Yates a position as foreman, which meant more responsibility but also more regular hours and better pay. The arrangement allowed him to be home most nights, only occasionally needing to stay at the ranch for roundups or when shipping cattle to market. Life settled into a satisfying pattern, but it wasn't without challenges. The harsh Montana winters continued to test their resilience. A particularly severe blizzard in their third year of marriage reminded them forcefully of their first meeting. As Yates fought his way home through driving snow, guided by the lantern Nora kept burning in the window. There were also the ordinary trials of frontier life: crop failures, illness, the isolation that sometimes pressed in during the long winter months. But through it all, Nora and Yates faced each challenge together, their partnership strengthened by mutual respect and deepening love. James grew into a thoughtful boy with a natural affinity for animals, especially horses. By the time he was 5, Yates had taught him to ride on a gentle pony purchased specifically for him. Elizabeth, true to her parents' predictions, developed into a spirited child with boundless curiosity and determination that sometimes outpaced her small body's capabilities. In 1882, their family expanded again with the birth of a second son, William Edward Remington. Will, as they called him, had his father's blue eyes and easygoing nature, content to observe the world with calm interest while his siblings raced around the homestead in endless games of imagination. As the children grew, Nora began teaching them their letters and numbers, drawing on her father's legacy as a teacher. She established a small schoolroom in one corner of the cabin during the winter months, ensuring her children would have the education that many frontier children lacked. Yates, for his part, taught them practical skills: how to track animals, predict weather changes, care for livestock, and navigate by the stars. He showed infinite patience with their questions and mistakes, his natural teaching ability surprising even him. "You're a good father," Nora told him one night as they lay together, the sounds of their sleeping children coming from the next room. "Better than I could have ever hoped for them." Yates pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair. "They make it easy. And they have an extraordinary mother to balance out my shortcomings." "What shortcomings?" Nora teased, her hand resting on his chest. "I've yet to discover them. Give it time," he laughed softly. "I'm sure they'll reveal themselves eventually." But as the years passed, Nora found herself falling more deeply in love with her husband, not less. The passionate attraction that had drawn them together evolved into something richer and more complex, a bond forged through shared joys and sorrows, through the daily work of building a life together. They established traditions that marked the passage of time: Christmas celebrations that filled their home with warmth and light during the darkest days of winter. Summer picnics by the creek where the children splashed and played. Harvest feasts to which neighbors from miles around were invited. The homestead gradually became known as a place of welcome in the community. Travelers passing through knew they could find a hot meal and friendly conversation at the Remington place. New settlers often sought Yates's advice on livestock and Nora's guidance on surviving their first Montana winter. When James turned 7, he began riding with Yates to the Diamond K occasionally, proud to be considered old enough to help. Elizabeth, not to be outdone, insisted on learning everything her brother did, from riding to roping to fishing in the creek. "She's got your determination," Yates commented to Nora after watching Elizabeth try 14 times to lasso a fence post before finally succeeding. "And your stubbornness," Nora replied with a fond smile. As the frontier slowly tamed around them, whispering pines grew from a small outpost to a proper town. A schoolhouse was built, and when James reached school age, Nora and Yates faced the decision of whether to send their children to town for education or continue teaching them at home. "They need to be around other children," Nora argued, though the thought of her babies being away all day caused an ache in her heart. "But town is still a long ride," Yates countered. Too far for daily travel, especially in winter. They compromised by arranging for the children to stay with the Jenkins in town during the school week, returning home for weekends and holidays. It was a wrenching adjustment at first, the homestead oddly quiet without the children's laughter and constant questions. "I miss them already," Nora confessed the first Monday night, the empty spaces at the dinner table painfully apparent. "So do I," Yates admitted, reaching for her hand. "But they were so excited about school, and they'll be home before we know it." He was right, of course. The children thrived in school, bringing home new ideas and friendships that enriched their family life. And the quiet weekdays allowed Nora and Yates to focus on projects that had been set aside in the busy years of raising young children. They expanded the orchard, built a proper smokehouse, and improved the irrigation system for the garden. Nora took up weaving on a loom Yates built for her, creating blankets and rugs that added comfort and beauty to their home. Yates, with his natural mechanical abilities, became known in the area for being able to repair everything from plows to clocks. Their 10th anniversary arrived in the spring of 1888. To celebrate, Yates arranged for the children to stay with the Jenkins for a week, while he took Nora on a journey to Helena, the territorial capital. It was the furthest Nora had traveled since arriving in Montana, and the first time they had been alone together for more than a day since James was born. "It feels strange," Nora commented as their train pulled away from Whispering Pines. "Wonderful, but strange to be just us again." Yates squeezed her hand, his eyes crinkling with the smile that still made her heart skip. "I thought we deserved some time to remember how it all began." The week in Helena was a revelation, sleeping late, dining in restaurants, attending a theatrical performance, and browsing shops filled with goods from the East. They purchased gifts for the children and a few luxuries for themselves, including books and a small music box that played Nora's favorite melody. In their hotel room, away from the responsibilities of the homestead and parenting, they rediscovered each other with the passionate intensity of newlyweds combined with the deep knowledge of long married lovers. Nora, now 30, felt more confident in her body and desires than she had as a young widow, while Yates, at 40, had lost none of his strength or enthusiasm. "I love you more now than the day we married," he told her one night, his body still entwined with hers. "And I didn't think that was possible." Nora traced the lines that had begun to appear at the corners of his eyes, marks of a life spent outdoors in all weather. "It's because we've built something real together, something that grows stronger with each passing year." Their return to the homestead brought joyful reunion with their children and a renewed appreciation for the life they'd created together. James, now 9, was growing tall and lanky, his interest in ranching deepening under Yates's guidance. Elizabeth, at 8, was a whirlwind of energy and opinions, excelling in school and continually surprising her teachers with her advanced reading abilities. 6-year-old will remain the quietest of the three, but his artistic talent was beginning to emerge in detailed drawings of the animals and landscape around the homestead. That autumn brought a surprising development when Dr. Williams, now in his 70s, approached Yates about purchasing his practice in Whispering Pines. "I know you're not a trained physician," the doctor told him, "but you've got a natural healing touch and you've learned a lot helping me over the years. With some proper medical books and my guidance before I retire, you could serve this community well." The offer sparked intense discussion between Nora and Yates. Taking over the doctor's practice would mean moving to town, leaving the homestead they'd worked so hard to build. It would mean a complete change in their way of life. "But think of the good you could do," Nora said as they discussed it late into the night, "how many lives you could save." "The homestead is our home," Yates countered. "It's where we've raised our children, where we've built our life together." They considered all angles the advantages for the children's education, the security of a profession less dependent on weather and market prices, the ability to be of service to the community that had embraced them, but also the sacrifice of space, independence, and the connection to the land they both loved. In the end, they reached a compromise that honored both their needs. They would maintain the homestead, with Nora overseeing its operation and the older children helping when not in school. Yates would establish a medical practice in town, staying there during the week and returning home for weekends. As the children grew older and more capable, he would gradually spend more time at the homestead again. Dr. Williams spent the winter teaching Yates everything he could, supplementing practical knowledge with medical texts ordered from back east. Yates approached the learning with the same dedication he'd shown in every aspect of his life, studying late into the night and practicing procedures under the doctor's watchful eye. By spring, the transition was underway. A small house in town became Yates's weekday residence and medical office. The sign outside read simply Y. Remington, medical practitioner, a title that acknowledged both his training and its limitations. The arrangement required adjustment for all of them. Nora took on more responsibility for the homestead, though James at 10 was increasingly capable of helping with many tasks. Yates missed the daily rhythms of ranch life, but found unexpected satisfaction in his new role, particularly when his care made a tangible difference in patients' lives. The first true test of his new skills came during a diphtheria outbreak that swept through Whispering Pines in the winter of 1889. For weeks, Yates worked tirelessly, using the techniques Dr. Williams had taught him and consulting the old doctor, now retired to a small cottage on the edge of town, when cases proved particularly challenging. When the epidemic finally subsided, with fewer deaths than similar outbreaks in neighboring communities, Yates returned to the homestead exhausted but with a new confidence in his abilities. "You saved many lives," Nora told him as they sat before the fire, the children finally asleep after welcoming their father home with exuberant hugs and endless questions. "Not all of them," Yates replied soberly, the loss of 3 young patients weighing heavily on him. "No one could have saved them all," Nora said gently. "But because of you, many families still have their children, their parents, their loved ones." The validation in her eyes meant everything to him. Throughout their years together, Nora's faith in him had been unwavering, her support the foundation on which he'd built every success. As 1890 approached, Montana prepared for statehood, and the Remington family prepared for changes of their own. James, now 11, was showing serious interest in medicine, often accompanying his father to the practice in town and absorbing information with remarkable speed. Elizabeth had declared her intention to become a teacher, inspired by stories of her grandfather and her mother's lessons. Will, at 8, remained quiet about his future plans, but continued to observe the world with artistic sensitivity, his drawings capturing the changing landscape of Montana with increasing skill. The homestead had evolved into a prosperous small ranch, with a herd of quality cattle, productive orchards, and gardens that supplied much of their food. The original cabin had been expanded several times and now stood as a comfortable family home, filled with evidence of their shared life: Nora's woven rugs and blankets, Yates's handcrafted furniture, the children's artwork and school certificates, books accumulated over years of learning together. One crisp autumn evening, as Nora and Yates sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, he took her hand in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their 12 years together. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. "The blizzard, finding you and James in the snow." "Often," Nora admitted, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Especially during winter storms, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "I try not to think about that," Yates said, his arm tightening around her. "The idea of never having found you, never knowing James and Elizabeth and Will. We found each other because we were both willing to risk everything," Nora reflected. "You carrying medicine through a deadly storm, me venturing out to save my child. Neither of us chose the safe path." "And that's been the pattern of our life together," Yates observed with a smile. "Taking chances, facing challenges head-on, building something neither of us could have created alone." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they sat in companionable silence, the warmth of their connection keeping the autumn chill at bay. From inside the house came the muffled sounds of their children, James explaining something to Will, Elizabeth practicing a recitation for school. "I think that night was just the beginning of us saving each other," Nora said softly. "We've been doing it ever since in all the ways that matter." Yates pressed a kiss to her temple, his heart full of gratitude for the woman who had become the center of his world. "And we'll keep right on doing it for all the days to come." As they rose to go inside, joining their children around the table for the evening meal, both knew it was true. Their story, which had begun in desperation and near tragedy, had blossomed into a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined. From a mother's desperate journey through a blizzard and a cowboy's determination to deliver medicine through a storm, had grown a legacy of love, healing, and home that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together.